Hi, welcome to the Marginalia Review of Books, the beginning of a special forum and symposium on an extraordinary new book by the Yale Professor of History, the Titus Street Professor of Ecclesiastical History, Bruce Gordon, who's authored The Bible, A Global History. Professor Gordon is perhaps the world's foremost authority on the Bible, an expert on the Protestant Reformation. He began his research on the Swiss Reformation, wrote award-winning books on the work of John Calvin, and then Zwingli, and a number of scholarly studies of the Bible, which have culminated in this beautiful, remarkable book, which gives a history as never done before of the origin of the Bible from its beginning to its current reception. Gordon shows that the Bible is the most extraordinary book in history, a book that in many ways has created history, which in fact has created many of the literary structures of history, the languages of many of the global alphabets. And the things he reveals in this book show that regardless of what any of us may believe, regardless of any of our personal backgrounds, the Bible is a book that is remarkably relevant. Indeed, he shows more relevant than ever, with surprising details about its current prevalence, for example, in China, Africa, and many other places, which I hope we'll discuss in this first conversation. Thank you so much for being here, Professor Gordon.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Samuel.
So could you talk a bit about what you see this book doing? You've been working on the Bible your entire life in a sense, if that's fair to say. And many people think of the Bible as a book for religious believers. And if they don't personally have any faith, or if they're from a different religious tradition, then they might think, a book on the Bible, that's for those people. But you've written this, of course, with a major New York press, Hachette, and it's really for everyone. But could you help us understand, why does a global history of the Bible matter? What led you to this approach?
Well, I think I really did want with this book to speak beyond communities of believers, though I'm been very pleased to talk to them, and many of them have found things that which were helpful and agreeable, and others have found the way that I addressed the Bible disagreeable, and I've certainly heard from them as well. But I wanted to speak to people because in our time, as you know, the Bible, certainly in North America, particularly in the United States, has a very public life. Beyond churches, it's part of a whole series of conversations, and those conversations are usually focused around claims to what this book actually says. And if there's one thing that I would say that is perhaps one amongst the most problematic things that can be claimed, is when somebody starts a sentence with "the Bible says," because the Bible says a lot of things, and a lot of those things are difficult to put together. They're difficult for theologians, they're difficult for Bible interpreters, they're difficult for people in churches, they're difficult for when the young Augustine reads the Bible from his very pious mother, Monica. He looks at this and says, "This is ridiculous. How could anybody possibly believe in this? These stories make no sense. They contradict themselves constantly." This book is, he has complete contempt for it. Compares it very unfavorably to Cicero and his classical education. This story has been repeated through the centuries. People have looked at this book and found it impenetrable. Jesus speaks in parables. His disciples almost always misunderstand what he says to them. They never get it right, and you can, at various moments, you can see that he's pretty frustrated, if not exasperated, by the fact that they don't seem to get the point. But on the other hand, why does he speak in parables to them then? Why doesn't he just say something? And it's this very curious, enigmatic nature of this sacred text. And so the reason I wanted to speak more broadly about this is that whether you like it or not, the Bible continue in even into our very secular times, pervades our society in many different ways. And it's still being held up as representing a variety of positions, convictions, beliefs. And people can see that these convictions and beliefs often conflict with each other, and can say, well, what is this book? What is this that we're all meant to believe, when the people who claim it as their sacred text are saying radically different things? So what I wanted to say in this book, amongst but the kind of the broader architecture of it, is to say this is a difficult book. It's always been a difficult book. It's been a book of that has inspired. It is a book that has uh, been of profound significance through the ages. But it is a book, as we all know, that has been used for extraordinary and horrific violence. Not when the debates about slavery, all manner of things that we can see where the Bible has been used to justify some of humanity's worst uh, uh, conduct and beliefs. So I found myself in with this book addressing people that I have talked to over a very long period of time. I wrote this book with a lot of people in my head, a lot of conversations in my head. A lot of my friends are not in the church, or would not say religion of any particular sort is plays a central role in their lives. That's just the way my life has been. I have a lot of close people who are in churches, but I have a lot of friends who, people that I know have known for a long time, who are not. And so those conversations that I've been fortunate to have with them over the years have shaped, well, how do I want to speak to them about this? How do I want to think about this text, which doesn't is not framed around a kind of narrative of belief. Although I take belief very seriously, I am myself a Christian, but and unapologetically so. But I think if we cannot speak beyond our own communities, then what on earth are we doing? And I that's what I want to do. Not to convert, not to persuade, but to say this book is remarkable. It's present in our lives, even if you don't think it is. And let's think about it, because it's a book over that, the Christian Bible has is a book of over almost 2,000 years old, and it has had these extraordinary range of lives in different communities, different languages. It has lived so many different lives and continues to do, primarily now in the amongst Christian communities in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. But it's a book that has always been able to engage with people in the localities, to uh, it's been a book that has always been a migrant. It's been a book that has always been able to speak to people in their own language. And I just think it's the most extraordinary story of something that has lived so many different lives. And I wanted to be able to speak to people, to see that um this is a phenomenon that has shaped us, whether we claim it as a holy text or not.
And I think the book does that so effectively. And I wonder, for example, you teach at Yale Divinity School, but also, of course, broadly in the history department at Yale College. So you have many different readers, even in your regular daily life as a professor. How are people today, for example, on Yale's campus and all these different communities, how do they respond to the Bible? Like, what do you find the experience of a modern student? So we can start there, and then I want to ask you about some of the broader forms of the Bible's reception that you write about in the book. But, of course, a very secular campus, but you're teaching Christians, atheists, people of all backgrounds. Do you find that they have a particular pattern of responses or the same kind of diversity that you record in the book? Do you see a microcosm of that as a professor teaching the history of religion?
Yeah, I mean, this is for me an enormous joy to be able to have these conversations with people, even at the Divinity School, who are in very, very different places. Not all of whom, certainly at all, would see themselves as in a kind of close relationship to the Bible, and then others do. It's certainly at the Divinity School, as you know, not a uniform culture of
Right.
this, and within that community there are radically different ways of not only of reading the Bible but of actually thinking about what it is. In the broader university community, which, as you say, I teach in a lot, um, yeah, I mean, the truth is, most of my undergraduates, unless they've come through religious families that are actively engaged in some form of Christianity, most of my students have very little knowledge of the Bible. Uh, Really, you cannot assume much familiarity at all, uh, and that's a reality. That's also true. I spent a lot of time in Europe. I was just there for a conference recently that was about young people and the church, and we were talking about the wider community, and essentially the same thing. There's very little knowledge of the Bible. But on the other hand, what I find is the positive side of that is with my students is they're often very curious. Um, I don't, on the whole, find people saying this is a horrible book. I don't want anything to do with it. They're curious. That they they say, well, tell me about this book. That we read passages. I find the conversations are fascinating and engaged and uh, very, very often very, very insightful. The fact that they don't know much about it, that's fine. But I find on the whole, they're not looking to be converted. They're not necessarily looking to take this up in a devotional way. But I find extraordinary amounts of interest in it and fascination with this book that has such a curious history of how it was created, and a book that seems to have so many different elements to it: poetry and history and letters and gospels, and what are gospels, and some of them are surprised that Jesus didn't write anything. It's actually all, in a sense, all reported speech, and so that there's all these questions about um, which are the actual authentic books, and so that it the actual Bible itself has a complicated and contested history. And that they find that fascinating. Why wouldn't you find it fascinating? This sacred text that at almost every point nobody's been able to quite agree on, and even today, as you know, in different traditions there are many different forms of the Bible. The Ethiopian Bible, the general version in the West for Protestants is 66 books, but in the Ethiopian Bible has 88 books, and or 87, I don't remember the exact number, but Protestants and Catholics have different versions of it. Protestants call something the Apocrypha that traditionally has been part of the Latin Bible of the West. So it's never just been that book that sits on the shelf. It's 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 constantly, even in its physical form, being in transition and in movement. And I find that when I talk to students about that, they get very excited, and they say, well, this is, yeah, I had no idea. And they have lots of questions, and some of the best conversations I have often are with first year undergraduates, and they want to know.
The excitement makes sense to be reading the book. And of course, for our listeners, I should tell them I was a Yale Divinity School graduate as well, had the privilege of studying with you there. And those who don't know, a very liberal ecumenical school like Yale Divinity School, in a way, you get more diversity of opinion around the Bible than amongst people who aren't even aware of the Bible for the whole range. And that's, I think, one of the things that you bring out in the book is, yes, the Bible has been and continues to be used for very unfortunate, you could say, dark purposes. And yet at the same time, the prevalent story of this shifting, living text, there's almost a kind of political power in it to show how we have a shared reference that's not stable. It's always changing. And yet it shows that that shared reference within that debate, there's been an enormous amount of congruence where communities can argue with each other. The Bible, in a sense, has been a kind of like broad temple in which not just the West, but the entire world can have a shared argument about what it means. So that even if you don't agree on what the Bible means, when you actually study the Bible or the history of the Bible, this library of sacred texts, you're entering into it in a way the greatest ongoing extended debate
Yeah.
or conversation. And in that context, and what you mentioned about the students being curious, how do you see the Bible in terms of contemporary education? Do you think it's problematic in general that there is a lack of biblical literacy? Not from a religious standpoint, but as a professor of history, do you think it would be better if, in a sense, for our global culture, we found ways to offer a broader awareness of the Bible? And if so, what are the consequences of the loss of biblical literacy?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. This is not an argument for religious education or some sort of catechetical exercise, but there can be no doubt that the the disappearance of what one might call biblical literacy or any level of familiarity with what Christians often will call the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, and then the New Testament, is greatly impoverished our engagement with our world, which has been suffused with uh, biblical language in its architecture, art, music, but also in the formation of legal systems, the formation of contested moral codes, certainly that, but that the biblical principles, variously interpreted, are in the lifeblood of just about every aspect of our life, even amongst those, of course, who are rejecting them. And someone like Voltaire, who was always held up as this sort of figure of who ridiculed the Bible, and he has some pretty funny things to say about the Bible, but he knew the Bible through and through, and he wrote commentaries on the Bible. He knew exactly what it was he was, rejecting, or even at times ridiculing. But he took the book very seriously, and so that if we lose that knowledge, we're losing a large part of who we are, and that is for both good and bad. If we, to discuss some of the most horrific aspects of in in the West, our history, such as slavery, without understanding the role of the Bible, both because for many it seemed to condone slavery, or the crucial part that the Bible played in the formation of uh, forms of spirituality and liberation that rejected slavery, enslavement. Um, we were reading in a course that I'm part of. We were uh, uh, reading texts from the 19th century, such as by Dubois, and which is through and through with biblical language, and it was wonderful. But of course, most of my students had no sense of what this was, and once we sat and talked about this, and some of the narratives from Exodus and other biblical, you could see that their sense of enrichment with this text growing. That's not converting them. It's not saying this is what you need to believe, but they see that this world that these people occupied was shaped in terms of language and thought, and even in music, where he includes spirituals in the lives of poor folk, and it's there, and um, and to understand that culture of African Americans that he's writing about, as which is so uh, deeply ingrained in scriptural uh, culture in every way, that when he writes about the lives of poor black folk, it's a biblical world, and uh, you could see the students there, they don't have access to it until they can understand that something of that biblical culture. And so without it, we're losing a huge part of ourselves. Uh, we're losing we're losing something that we have cannot have access to, because we don't have that ability to um, engage with the Bible. And again, as I keep saying, this is not about being a Christian or being a faithful person. It's about being part of the culture that we inhabit. It also, in our global world today, the um, if we have no engagement with the Bible, we are struggling to make contact with communities across the globe where Christianity is growing exponentially, whether Pentecostalism, Catholicism, all sorts of different forms. And we are losing the ability to access, to communicate, to talk with those communities, if we have no ability to enter into their world, where the Bible, in very different ways, but the Bible um, is a living is a living entity. Um, so it makes us provincial and isolated, in the sense that um, we can't be part of that conversation.
And this is, I think, a very profound aspect of your work, and something I always appreciate about you as a teacher as well, which is, of course, it's not about converting people to a particular religious community. It's about being educated. And being educated, as you point out, has at least three different dimensions. If we lose access to the Bible, we lose access to our history, first of all, because the Bible is the kind of, in a sense, it's the cosmology of our history. And to lose access, that means we can't enter the world of the past in our own cultural tradition. But then at a contemporary global level, as you point out, and I want to ask about this because I think many people are not aware, the role of the Bible has not decreased over time. One of the extraordinary things that you bring out in the book is, in fact, that the Bible's presence in the world, as you were alluding to, is greater than ever. And therefore, you could say a second dimension is, you could say, frankly, diplomatic, right? That you cannot diplomatically, even from the standpoint of geopolitics, understand what is the present and a certain future of many large parts of the world today if you don't understand how important the Bible is in those communities, culturally, politically. And then that's related to an anthropological point, which is from the standpoint of just being a good global citizen, where you go into a culture, not to judge it, but to be able to simply interact respectfully. The role of the Bible in global culture is massive. Could you share a bit about, for example, the importance of the Bible in contemporary China and Africa, which those chapters I think were extraordinary, but Maybe to start off by giving you the sort of prompt that you brought out, where are the most Bibles printed today? I think this was so remarkable. I mean, this
Testing me
was
on my own
extraordinary.
book. Yeah, no, it's China. The
China. So the most
China,
Bibles
China,
are printed
China,
today, 200
China,
million.
China produces by far the greatest number of Bibles. The Amity publishing house in China is enormous, and most of the Bibles that you will see in churches in America or in bookstores or anywhere else where you might see a Bible, uh, most likely printed in China. And this is, which is, of course, an interesting thing because the place of the Bible in China is a very complicated story. But the Bible, and it's something that I talk about in many ways at various points through its life, the Bible has been commodified and become an object of trade and commerce. So it's part of its many lives is sometimes been as an object of exchange.
The
So,
world's bestseller.
the world's bestseller, but also um, in particularly in medieval and early modern culture, it was a gift. So if you go to the Morgan Library or and you see these wonderful ornate Bibles, why do we have to have a Bible with jewels and gold and inlaid like this? Because not only because those precious stones are a reflection of the holiness of the book, the material book, but it's also because the Bible frequently was a a most honored gift, and that gift was not just something you left with somebody. The Bible was seen as a gift which bound together both the giver and the receiver in this spiritual friendship, this spiritual relationship. So one of the things I wanted to explore in this is that the very materiality of the Bible as a book has been hugely important in its many different lives, right through to today. The physicality of the Bible, whether it's being held up in Pentecostal churches to curse or to heal, it's not just words. It's the Bible in its material form, in its physical form, has been seen as an object of power, an object of relationship, a book that speaks in and embodies the very sacred language that it contains. So it itself, and many people may be familiar with the liturgical traditions in the Eastern churches, but also in Catholicism in the West, that Bibles or New Testaments or sometimes Gospels are part of the liturgical worship the of of the church, and the fact that they're carried around or kissed in these shows that it's the book itself is a holy object, becomes like an icon or a relic, and that the book itself creates sacred space. So it's part of its lives is not just reception or interpretation or translation. All those things are really important, and I want to make them part of the story. But it's physicality as an object that creates sacredness around it, and in touching and kissing and hearing, it engages all of our senses. So it's a story about this force of life, which uh, which engages us in all of our senses, and uh, and so this just goes back to what we talked about China in there, where printing of Bibles is a very profitable industry, and the Bible is certainly becomes a part of our consumer culture now. It is something to be sold and becomes part of our of trade relations and all the rest of it. Um, but that the Bible as commodity has always been part of its story. When Gutenberg prints the Bible in the 1450s, he does it because he has already sold subscriptions. There's a financial framework to the printing of the first Bible. He's a businessman, and he knows that the most profitable book to print is a Bible, so he begins with that. That's not all he did. It's not the the totality of the story, but financial calculations were certainly there right from the beginning.
And
So
so you show.
so
Oh,
our modern story of China producing the Bibles for the world is in that sense no great revolution. It's always existed in the world of commerce.
so it's part of, in a way, the ongoing history of the Bible as in this amazing connection that you're bringing out, that the sacredness of the Bible as just pure matter is then inseparable from its sort of great power, as you could say, the most we would think of as secular and mundane forces, as a great engine of economic transformation, of profit. And
Yeah,
so our
exactly,
our
exactly.
separation of the sacred